So what if I told you that there is another historical wallflower romance that prominently features a hot air balloon mishap? You would probably say, Melody, I believe you, because that is a really weird thing to lie about. And you would be right on both counts, because today we are talking about Isabel and the Rogue by Liana de la Rosa, who is the author of last year's Ana Maria and the Fox, which is the first in the Luna Sisters romance series that Isabel is the follow-up for. Now, I did talk about Ana Maria last year, if you want to swing back to that, but today we are talking about the middle sister, Isabel, who is the wallflower, but not just the wallflower. She is also a spy of sorts. Now, in the first book, we were introduced to the Luna sisters and the fact that they were coming over to England from Mexico due to the French occupation. But they are not just refugees of this occupation going to meet their uncle, who is the ambassador, but they are diplomats in their own right. And we saw that from Ana Maria, especially in the first book, and we see that with Gabby, the youngest sister, as well to a certain extent, though she wasn't the focus by any means of this book, obviously, because this is Isabel's story. Now, Isabel is a little different because, again, she is the wallflower, but she has been using this to her advantage in that she has been spying on Mexican democratic interests in Britain. Now, this puts her further in the path of Gideon Fox's friend Sirius, who we met in the first book, and that Isabel and Sirius didn't really get off on a perfect footing, and this is further complicated by the fact that Sirius has caught her kind of sneaking around, and he actually is an operative for the Home Office. And so while they both have these espionage interests of sorts, they are also finding themselves drawn more and more to each other, particularly Sirius, who has this reputation as a kind of rake that he has really played up in a similar way to Isabel playing up her wallflower status in order to kind of blend in and have people expect a very particular thing from him that allows him to gather this information. And so in the course of their own missions and finding themselves drawn more to each other, Sirius finds an opportunity for his information and his skills to kind of assist Isabel, especially as they are both seeking information from the same peer who has also now expressed interest in Isabel, but they are both trying to gauge whether his French family connections allow him access to more information than even he is aware of the import of. And so both are getting closer to him. This is further complicated by the fact that they both genuinely like this guy. He is a good guy, but they can't help but suspect that he has some vital information. For Isabel, she believes that he might inadvertently have information that will illuminate some of the French plans in Mexico and help not only the president that is on the run, but her parents who are high up in the government. Now, you kind of have to know that from the first book. It is kind of indicated, but there is a lot that you almost have to kind of carry over from the first romance. And so while we do shift focus in this to our new couple, still thankfully in that third person dual point of view, I would recommend that you read the first book on some level. You will be fine without it, but I do think it adds extra depth. Now, to be fair, there are other romances this could be said of, and you can do what you want, but I do think it helps establish the stakes in particular. So we have this espionage setup, this wallflower element, and there really is that kind of lessons element to a certain extent. If you liked that piece from the first part of Bridgerton season 3, it's obviously different here, but it is Sirius agreeing to help Isabel in her espionage efforts and basically give her access or further information or a lookout because he is afraid she is going to get caught rifling through these rooms because he has caught her rifling through these rooms. Now, if you remember from my conversation about Ana Maria and the Fox, I loved the world that was established, the characters that were established, but I did have some issues with the pacing and the show versus tell balance in the book. I am happy to report that I did think that this struck a better balance and that the pacing was vastly improved, though I do still have some critiques in the show versus tell, which we can get into, but I really did love these characters, similar to how I really did love Ana Maria and Gideon Fox. And similar to those two, we have characters here that have really big goals and ambitions or a strong moral center and compass. We have Isabel, who is basically attempting to help save her entire country and has taken on a lot of weight of that responsibility on her shoulders. And she's gauging a lot of her self-worth by whether or not she succeeds in this, especially as she feels that outside of the connections that she's formed with her sisters, because when they came over to England, they had been kind of pitted against each other in childhood by their father. And so they really rediscovered those bonds and that relationship in England. And so she has formed those bonds, but she hasn't really formed outside connections like her sisters have, especially in this book, setting her up against Gabby, who is a little bit more popular, but also knowing her book is next. And even from what we get in this book, that is not all it appears to be for Gabby, but Isabel kind of having to come out of her own shadow in many ways. So it's returning to this idea of kind of confidence as part of the wallflower equation. I will say also, while we're on Isabel as a character, there were moments, and I don't know if this goes into some of the show versus tell, which I'm going to circle back to in terms of the characterization, but there were moments that were very self-deprecating from Isabel. She would be given a compliment and would immediately undermine it. And in a way, within the narrative perspective, this could feel kind of disingenuous because it felt like it was playing into some of that tell rather than show, but I also very much sympathize with that self-deprecating nature and have to find myself checking myself similarly often. So I can definitely see both sides of that characterization, but I think we saw a lot of Isabel telling us she was a wallflower, and we didn't see a whole lot of her being a wallflower, if that makes sense. We saw people flocking to Gabby, and so we really kind of set up the two sisters in comparison almost in order to illustrate Isabel being a wallflower. We also had a scene with one of Sirius's former paramours, a woman he forged a connection with in the first place because of a mission, though she of course does not know that. Seeing her kind of trying to cut down Isabel when she recognizes some of Sirius's attention, or maybe because she just doesn't like to be not the center of attention, because this takes place after the aforementioned balloon incident. And I honestly cannot remember if it is the same woman from Anna Maria and the Fox, because there is a ballroom scene in that book, and I called it out in the Feature Friday discussion for that book, that I think is handled really subtly. And I love how it maneuvers the kind of backhanded compliments and the kind of subtleties of cutting someone down in polite society. Here, it felt a lot less subtle, and it was being used kind of twofold, both to kind of establish Isabel as other within this circle, but also to kind of express casual xenophobia and colonialist ideas and how they kind of permeate, especially in these kind of upper echelons of society. And while it was incredibly satisfying to see Sirius kind of cut her down in these moments and be in Isabel's corner, I felt like it lacked some of the nuance that that ball scene in the prior book really had, that accomplished a lot of the same narrative goals. I felt a lot more deftly, but I can forgive it because I do think that there is a lot in this book that is handled a lot more skillfully. And in some ways, I think it goes back to conversations we've been having similar to the one we had in Never Blow a Kiss, or that we had briefly, I believe, at the end of the live discussing the reread of Romancing Mr. Bridgerton prior to season 3 of Bridgerton dropping. This idea of wanting a little bit more forward of an editing hand, especially for new romance voices, because, and I know that sounds kind of shady, but what I mean is, all of the pieces are here. These are great characters. The plotting of this makes sense. The motivations make sense, but it's just a little too obvious sometimes, and it doesn't fully trust us as readers to get there on our own. It is telling us a lot of these things, whether it be the kind of political overlays, whether it be the emotional interiors. I think that there was a lot of opportunity to show us some of this. For instance, with Sirius, we do see some of this. For instance, we know from the book that he is a war veteran, and we see him struggling with survivor's guilt throughout the narrative, but some of this is handled a little bit more actively than other aspects of it. For instance, we see him basically providing work or kind of a soft place to land for other veterans through employment, a place to stay at his country estate, this, that, or the other, while also using his place in the home office to a similar aim. But then we have the aspects like him being a rake to kind of hide these endeavors, being told to us very bluntly. This may be a little bit that it feels like we have to justify the rake's rakish behavior in current romances, which on some level I do get, but that feels a little bit of that rather than letting us as readers understand that ourselves or get there ourselves. Similarly, with that survivor's guilt, there is a lot of understandable inner turmoil there. So again, we are more told about the inner turmoil than shown the inner turmoil, though it is an attempt to show us, but because we only see it once, it doesn't land. So, for example, we have this idea of Sirius having nightmares of when he was shot on the battlefield. That makes sense, is a very understandable kind of given circumstance for a hero of this nature to have. And as a romance reader, that doesn't really shock me. Though we don't seem to be going the he can only get a good night's rest with his love interest route. But we do see him having this nightmare in Isabel's company and them kind of discussing it. And so it becomes a way for him to kind of tell her all of this information about his backstory, but we don't really see the change in stasis there. So it was a really great opportunity for him to have all of this inner conflict and to be weighted down by this thing, and for us to see it as a reader and for Isabel to really shift that. Now, I'm not saying that that attempt wasn't made. I'm saying that we got so much of it bluntly told to us that it didn't land as firmly as it could have. Now, blunt feels kind of a strong word. I think that it was a little bit more fluid, especially even than the last book, which also is why I would have loved to see an editor take more of a hand in this, a guiding hand, because I think it's further proof that the pieces are there. And when the pieces fall together more organically, the emotional resonance is going to be more. Because I was relying a lot on the kind of archetypes of these two characters to really feel that emotional weight, because it could be hard at a given moment to know what the emotional stakes of that moment were. Additionally, while there was a kind of espionage target to the narrative, they didn't really know what they were looking for in terms of information, or if this person even had it. So it didn't really feel like we were going after something in particular actively, and that gave them less forward momentum from that plotline. I don't think it necessarily hindered it all the way by any means, but it offered less centralization of that plotline that could have been used to kind of navigate the emotional beats at the same time. Again, similarly in some ways to what we discussed with Never Blow a Kiss. Now, this kind of information plotline, this espionage light plotline, did put us into some empty offices, some empty studies. But did they stay empty? Which brings us to one of our first intimate scenes, which I know I will probably spoil a little bit, but I will do my best to not rob you of that full experience. However, this was one of those books where I honestly skimmed through some of the intimacy scenes because they hadn't felt completely emotionally earned, or some of the tenor of the intimate scenes didn't necessarily match my perception of the tenor of the emotional arc at that point, and maybe it's a little bit personal preference. However, there is a moment where they are in an empty room that is soon to not be empty, and they of course have to hide, which puts them under a desk. Now, pushed up against each other, hiding under a desk is an intimate space. I get it. However, they proceed to get further intimate in this space while there are two other people in the room, which may be up your alley. However, my suspension of disbelief was suspended when there was more dialogue there than I felt logistically possible. Somebody was gonna hear something. And that's just how I feel about that. Is that nitpicky? Is that a very specific moment where you're probably like, Melody, just get in the spirit of the moment? Absolutely. But I just couldn't. As someone who doesn't consider themselves particularly observant in their real life, I cannot imagine not observing that. But I guess I would have to be in that situation to really know, and I do not foresee that happening. And so I really liked these characters and where this narrative wanted to live, but especially in this book that really focused on the espionage and the kind of political landscape for Mexico during the French occupation, I felt like it didn't really give us a full sense of the kind of information that was passing back and forth and the true circumstances. And we didn't, again, know the real stakes because we had the sense that the Luna sisters' parents were on the run, but we didn't really know what was going on there. And again, in this aspect, I do appreciate that it didn't tell us more than show us in ways that it did in other parts of the book. But I think there was the opportunity to play with that information plotline and the informant plotline a little bit more in terms of getting to explore that history a little bit more as well. And then that would have made the stakes there more evident and really raised them throughout the book, especially as Isabel's stakes in terms of her kind of emotional life and this kind of grappling with where she wants to be makes so much sense and does carry so much weight because she is longing to go back to her home and to this country. And so her kind of struggle with that in her emotional life in terms of falling in love with Sirius, but also just her trying to find her purpose and how she can contribute and fit in. And I think that if that had been amped up a little bit in combination with amping up seeing her be a wallflower, seeing her feel not at home here, but also over the course of the narrative, watching her blossom in a lot of ways and find connections. Another piece I really would have loved to explore more is we see her start to form a friendship with another young lady, and we really only get one scene between the two. And I really would have loved to have that friendship and that blossoming friendship mirroring the relationship that was building with Sirius in terms of having some more conflict between where her heart is pulling her, especially with her sisters kind of establishing themselves in England a little bit, or at least being there longer in Gabby's case, since we don't know where she's going to land yet, while Isabel still feels like Mexico is where she is being called home to. And so there's a lot going on here, and I'm not implying I didn't enjoy this book because again, I really did enjoy the characters and the setup here, but I could also see the potential for it to push even further just with the building blocks it had already established. But if you were looking for another wallflower romance, this might be right up your alley. I am planning to do a video of wallflower romance recommendations if that is something you would be interested in. I am just trying to get some rereads done as I have still been in a mini reading slump, or I've been reading a lot slower, as you may have noticed with the gaps in Feature Fridays. But hopefully I'm getting back into the swing of things. Not that you need justification, but between like Bridgerton and starting a new job, and my eyes have been a little wonky lately. Fun fact, I have a very high prescription, and with my very high prescription, sometimes you get floaters, and I'm at the age where that is starting to happen. How fun! Anyway, if you read this book, let me know what you're thinking. I would love to hear your thoughts. Like and subscribe if you feel like it, I guess. Read something good, and yeah, bye.